And now we turn to Daf Ayin Vav Amud Beis. But Ha, meaning the daughter of Paro, Lo Tzricha, she doesn't need Otra Gedula. She herself is a Bas Melech. She has plenty of wealth. And therefore we could assume that when she comes to be Misgayer, that's a Gerus L'Shem Shamayim, and therefore we could accept her as a Gerus. So now the Gemara goes back to ask on the Loshen Chitun, which means that the Gemara's premise is that if Ein Kiddushin Tofsin, then the language Chitun in the Tanakh is inappropriate. So the Gemara asks for Tepaklei, if you want to know whether Shlomo could have married Bas Paro, and therefore the Loshen Chitun is appropriate, I'll give you another reason why he couldn't have married Bas Paro legitimately. Even though, again, we're holding A, that she was Miskayer, and B, that the Gerus was sincere. She doesn't need the Malchus and the Ashirus of Klal Yisrael. She's a Bas Malchus. But typically, I'll tell you why the word Chitun is out of place here. The Hamitris Rishonah. She's not just a regular Gioris, she's a Mitzris, and she's first generation Mitzris. So the Torah says that Dar Shlishi of Ohem. So therefore, Bas Paro herself, even though she was a Gioris, she's a Mitzris Rishona. And a Mitzris Rishona lo tafsi be Kiddush. Now here we have to introduce a Gemara in Ksubas Taf Chav Tesamid Beis in the name of Rav Simoy. And Rav Simoy holds that Ein Kiddushin Tovsin B'chayvei Esed. And Mitzri is the case, Mitzri Rishon, Mitzri Sheni is the case of Chayvei Esed. If there's no Tfisis Kiddushin in Chayvei Esed, like in the case of a Mitzris, and Bas Paro is clearly a Mitzris, then how could the Tanakh use the word chasana to describe by Yischaten Shlomo as Bas Paro Melch Mitzrayim? There's no Tfisis Kedushin according to Rav Simoy. She's a Mitzvah Rishona, and Chayvei Esei if he marries a Mitzvah Rishona. And if you'll answer that in truth, the language of Chitun is not shaykh when it comes to Goyim, because there's no Tfisis Kiddushin. And why does the word Chitun apply to Bas Paro? And the answer is Hanoch, we don't have the Mitzrim. Hanoch, the original Mitzrim, at the time that Klal Yisrael were Mishubadim to Mitzrayim, and about those mitzvahs the Torah prohibited Ad Dar Shlishi, Azli Lialma, those mitzvahs are gone. They were killed, they died at Yam Tov. And when the Torah prohibits us from marrying a mitzvah, Ad Dar Shlishi, that was said b'Mitzrayim, regarding those Mitzrim that came to Klal Yisrael from Mitzrayim. They attached themselves to Klal Yisrael. We call it the Erev Rav. So the Torah was addressing Klal Yisrael who had Erev Rav, and these were the original Mitzrim, the real McCoy Mitzrim that became part of the Erev Rav. But the Mitzrim that we find at the time of Shlomo HaMelech, Achrini Ninu, that's a whole different nation, whole different nationality. The Torah only prohibited those Mitzrim that were Meshabed Klal Yisrael. So if this be the case, then Bas Paro is not a mitzvah at all. We call her a mitzvah, but she's not, technically, legally, she's not a mitzvah because there's nothing left to the original Mitzrayim. So Mimelu Tosim Kedushin, and now we understand and appreciate the Lashon Chasnas. Gemara rejects this. But Tanya, we went to the Bryce on Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that Minyamin, there was a person by the name of Minyamin who was a Ger Mitzri. And Hoyali Chaver, me tell me they Rabbi Akiva, he's one of the bunch. He was one of the Chabura of Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. And he admitted to us, Omar, he declared, Ani, I underwent Gerus, and I'm a Mitzri Rishon. Vinasasi, I got married to a Giores, Sha'afhi Mitzris Rishona. She's also Mitzris Rishona. So now my children, says Minyamin, will be a Mitzri Sheni. Okay, so now what's going to happen? The son is a Mitzri Sheni. Asi libni Mitzri Shnia. I'll marry him off to a Mitzri Shnia. Kadeshi had been Bini, my child, my grandson, which is Dar Shlishi, Roy Lava Bakal. Because Dar Shlishi, the Torah says, Yavo Lahem Bakal Hashem. So we see clearly that the Mitzrim, which the Torah prohibited, did not all die in Yamsuf. There are those who live in Mitzrayim, and they are Mitzrim. And that's true at the time of Talmidi Rabbi Akiva. Olshkein at the time of Asparo, she was a Mitzvah Rishona. And yet, if lo tafsi be kiddushin, why does the Torah use the word chita? Rav Papa wants to offer another answer as to why the lashon chasnus is applicable to bas para. Anan mishlomo leku v'nasiv. I'll read to you the translation. He says, Ani anu namod v'nikshe milakicha shlomo es paspar madua kosu b'loshen chipun af shelo tafsi bekedushin haregam beloze lo shayach etzel shlomo loshen chipun shekain me'apasuk anu lomdim sheshlomo lo nasiv midi. This is pretty radical. According to Rav Papa, Shlomo Melech never married Bas Para. I guess you would say he was fooling around. Dichsivbe, the pasuk says, "Min hagoyim asher amar Hashem el bnei Yisrael lo savo b'hem ve'im lo yavo b'chem, achein yatu es levavchem achrei Eloheihem b'hem dovak Shlomo li'ava." Very heavy words here, but the Gemara, in the name of Rav Papa, understands this literally, that dovak Shlomo li'ava, which means he was dovek bebas paro only because of ava. He was not interested in ishus or in chasnus, but just, I guess, what you'd call intimacy. So Elakasha. So now we're back to square one. So why does the Tanakh say Vatischatein Vaischatein Shlomo as Paro Melch Mitzrayim? He had such an intense love for her that the Torah calls it like as if he married her. It's a borrowed term. Amalei Ravina Rav Ashi. How could Rav Sheshes quote a brisa and derive from the brisa that a Kohen Patsua Daka is allowed to marry Nesina? From our Mishnah, we could derive the opposite conclusion. It says, it doesn't say Mutarim B'Nesina. From the fact that the Mishnah omits Nesina, it implies that the P'tuadaka is allowed to marry a Gioris, because anybody can marry Gioris, and they were matir P'tuadaka, but Ha B'Nesina Asiri, since the Mishnah only mentions a heter for Giores, the implication to derive is that they are prohibited from marrying a Nesina. So it turns out like this, just to make the final calculation, the scoreboard here. Rav Sheshes proves that a Kohen P'tuadaka is allowed to marry a Nesina. But the Mishnahs, it would give us the exact opposite conclusion. And that is that although a P'tuadak is allowed to marry Gioris, he's apparently, by omission from the Mishnah, it seems that he's not allowed to marry a Nesina. So why does Rav Sheshes prefer a Brisa when it contradicts a Mishnah? Amalei, so Rav Ashi says to Ravina, Uletamech, according to your Shita, that you could derive from the Resha of the Mishnah that a P'tuadaka Krushavcha is not allowed to marry Nesina, Ema Seif. I want to derive the exact opposite conclusion from the Seif of the Mishnah. Because the Seif of the Mishnah says, V'enon asurim elo milovo bakal, meaning they're only Isers to call. And that explains why they're allowed to marry Gioris, because Kahal Gerim lo nikra Kahal. Baham Nesina, Sharu. Nesina is also not included on the call. Now we saw that Mamzerim are allowed to marry Nesinim, etc. Is Sharu, Mutarim Lisaena. So we have the exact opposite conclusion from the Seifa and the Resha. So we really have no possible conclusion to come to from the Mishnah, and therefore we should derive the din from that which is explicit in the Brisa to attack his mutter Vinesina. Okay, this leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis. Amoni umo avi asurim lavo bakal v'isuram iser olam. No matter how many generations, the Torah says, Gam Dor Asiri lo yovo lahem bekal Hashem ad olam. Avol nikvoseihem utaros miyad. But an Amonis or a Moavis after Gerus are mutal lava bekal. And the question is, why is it that Zecharim Asurim, but they gave us mutaros? So that's what we're going to have to analyze in the Gemara. The Mishnah continues, Mitzri v'adomi einam asurim elad shlosha doros, echad zcharim v'echad nekevos. With regard to Mitzri, the Torah doesn't distinguish between male and female, and in all cases, we wait till Dar Shlishi, to allow them to come into the call. Rabbi Shimon matir sanekevos miyat. Rabbi Shimon holds that the female members of Mitzri Vadomi are mutter immediately after they gerus. And Rabbi Shimon Kal V'chomer Dvarim. The reason I'll be matir the nekevos of Mitzri and Adomi is because of a Kal V'chomer. Uma im b'makom sha'asr says charim iser ola. In the case of Ammon and Moab. So we're going to try to derive Mitzri and Adomi from Ammon and Moab. In the case of Ammon and Moab, the Torah prohibits the Scharim on Iser Olam, and yet Hitus and Akevus Miyad is there for Kal V'chomer. How much more so? Makom Shelo Asur says Scharim Ela'ad Shlosh Doros, meaning Mitzri is more kal than an Ammoni or Moavi, and yet the Torah is a nodin shenatus and kevus miyad. If the Torah was matir the nekevos of Ammon and Moab, and how much more so the Torah would be matir the nekevos of Mitzri Vadomi. And how do I know that Ammon and Moab is more chomer than Mitzri? Because in Ammon and Moab it's ad olam, whereas in Mitzri it's only ad shlosha doros. So if we see clearly that Ammon and Moab is more chomer than Mitzri Vadomi, and yet the Torah was mat to their wives, how much more so than the nekevos of Adomi and Moab and Mitzri? Amrullah, the Chacham responded in halacha, if you have a Kabbalah from your Rabbosach that Mitzri Vadomi and Kevus Mutaris Miyad Nekabel, we're not going to argue against the Kabbalah. But Im Lidin, if it's based on the logic of a Kal V'chomer, without a Kabbalah mi Rabbosecha, is Yesh Tshuva. I have a pircha on the Kal V'chomer. So what is the pircha on the Kal V'chomer? So the Gemara is going to explain this. Amalehem Reb Shimon responded, Lo ki halochani omer. I'm not coming up with my own Kal V'chomer, for which I have a pircha, but rather I am quoting a Kabbalah. I have a Kabbalah that the nekevos of Mitzri Vadomi mutaros after gerus immediately. So Gemara asks me, Nani Mili, how does the Mishnah assume, and no one seems to question this premise, that in the case of Ammon and Moab, the nekevos are mutaros? How do you derive such a conclusion? Rabbi Yochanan the Omar Kra, this is a pasuk in the parasha of David and Goliath, Sefer Shmuel, Perek, Shmuel Aleph, Perek Yud Zayin. The Kiro Shol as David Yotze Likras HaPlishti. Right, David was the one who volunteered to take up Goliath in his challenge and face him. Is at that moment when Shaul realized that David is going out there for a battle against Goliath, Omer el Avner Sartzava, Shaul turns to his chief commander, Ben Mizeh Hanar. We have to underline those words. Ben Mizeh Hanar. Interesting. He doesn't seem to be asking about the identity of David, but rather David's father. Who is David's father? Avner. He addressed it Avner. Vayomer Avner, Chei nafshecha hamelech yadati. He swears by the life of the king, I don't know. The verse says, what do you mean, v'lo yadale? I mean, Shaul HaMelech did not recognize David. Vaksiv, and now we go back to an earlier pasuk in the same chapter, that when Shaul didn't have Ruach Hashem, he called upon David to be menagein bekino. So it says, Vayovo David el Shaul, Vayamel lefanov, Vayaveu miot, Vayhilo nenosei kelen. So obviously the pasuk is outspoken about the love that Shaul had for David. So he knew who David was. Why is he asking Avner ben mi zehana? And the Gemara adds the following. Maybe you'll say that Enochinami, Shaul certainly recognized David, but he wasn't asking about David's identity. He was asking about David's father. Elavua kamishal. So Gemara rejects this as well. The Aviv lo yodale. Are you telling me that that I don't recognize, that Shaul doesn't recognize the father of David, Yishai? Vaksiv, it says in the parasha of the Milchama in Goliath, Ish bimei Shaul zaken baba nashim. And this pasuk is referring to Yishai. The Omer of V'temer Rabbi Abba zaken ba nashim ze Yishai avi David shenichnas l'chlusya v'yotza b'chlusya. Uchlusya, Rashi says 600,000 Shishim Rivui. He was the Sar over Shishim Rivui. So certainly Shaul recognized Yishai. And the Gemara answers, Hachi Kamar Shaul. This was the intention of Shaul when he asked Ben Mihanar. He knew that David was the son of Yishai. He knew therefore that David came from Shevet Yehuda. But Shevet Yehuda divides into two main branches. There was Peretz and Zorach. Imi Peretz Asi, Imi Zorach Asi. So there's Zaro, he could have been Zaro Shel Peretz ben Yehuda or Zaro Shel Zorach ben Yehuda, or Zerach ben Yehuda. Imi Peretz Asi Malka. The name Peretz is indicative of the branch of Yehuda that's going to reach Malchus. Why? Why is Peretz Malchus? Shemelech Poretz Lasos Loderech. V'yemimachin biyod. Rashi learns he could be Poretz Gedoros and Sodeim Shalacherim. I forget how you say that in Latin. It's a famous Latin word for that. Anyway, the king can take over the Sados of Acherim. The Rambam has a different shot that during the war, he can plow through the Sados. And no one could object. But if he comes from Zerach, then he's chashiv, but he's not going to become the king. My timer Amalei Sha'al Alei. What kind of manifestation of behavior did he see in David that indicated that David might become the next king? The Gemara answers, it says in the Parsha of Milchemes David Goliath Vayal Beis Shaul as David Mado, that Shaul put his own garments onto David. Kimi Daso, Madov means Kimi Daso, that the clothing of Shaul fit exactly David. Right? Shaul is the tallest of everyone. So it must have been a great miracle that the garment of Shaul fit, little David. Not that he was short necessarily, but relative to Shaul. Amalo Doeg Adomi. Doeg turns to Shaul and he says the following. You're asking if he comes from Peretz. and he's Hagun Lamalchus, or from Zarach and he's only for Gedula and Chashivus, Chalav, you should have asked a more basic fundamental question. In Roy Lava B'Kolim Lav, my time of the Kosi Mirusa Moaviyah. He's Mizara Shel Rusa Moaviyah, and the Torah says, Lo Yovo Amoni V'Kal Hashem. Amalei Avner Sartzavo is also a shtickle Talmud Chacham. He says to Doeg, I think was the head of the Bezdin, the head of Sanhedrin. Nina, we have a brisa, and the brisa dashens the posca Moni v'lo Amonis, Moavi v'lo Moavis. The Torah only prohibited the males, not the females. So what are you telling me that David is not Roy Lakol? So Doeg says, wait a minute, Avner. Elameato, if you're going to tell me that any time it says in the Torah, in the male masculine, it means to exclude the females, is mamzer v'lo mamzeret. The Torah uses the Lashon Zachar to describe a mamzer. So we should say that you're allowed to marry a mamzeres. So Avner responds that you have no proof of the word mamzer. Mamzer indicates both males and females. Mamzer, mum zar. He has the mum of zaros, meaning that his mother had a relationship with someone who's zar. So the pagam of mamzeres is because of the be'ilah zar, that foreign person who had a relationship with a mother, and that pagam, there's no difference between a male and a female. Though he comes back to ask another kasha to Avner. What about Mitzri? Right? The Torah says that you're not allowed to marry a Mitzri until Dar Shlishi. V'lo Mitzris. Maybe we should say that you're allowed to marry a Mitzris Dar Rishon. And again, Avner responds to Doeg, Shiny Hacha. In the case of Bnei Yevamot, it's different. In a farish time of the Krah, the Torah says explicitly why we're not going to allow Ammon and Moav to enter into Klal Yisrael. So that makes sense with regard to the male members of Ammon and Moav. The males should have come out and brought the Jewish people lechem umayim, but lo darka shalisha l'kadeh. I mean, a woman is more reticent, so she's more modest. So therefore, in the case of Ammon and Moav, where the Torah explains why we exclude Ammon and Moav, that taina against Ammon and Moav applies to the male members, but not to the female members. So now Doeg comes back and says to Avner, but still the women are also guilty, the women of Ammon and Moav. Why? Let the women come forward with lechem umayim for the female members of Klal Yisrael. Ish ticket Avner had no answer. Miyad. As soon as Shaul heard what Doeg was arguing, excuse me for just 1 minute. I just have to answer a phone call, sorry.